and me, and here I must stand with a tear in me, both sighing and sickly, me sweetheart to see.
In 1914, both banks of the River Tyne from its mouth to Scotswood were lined with great industries. These were prime sites, as the area had coal to fuel factories and the river to transport raw materials and finished products. This is the story of the industries that occupied the north bank of the Tyne from the quayside as far west as Scotswood. Join us as we journey westwards along the riverside. You can walk the first half of this route along a pleasing path which is part of the Hadrian's Wall National Trail, although the Roman wall didn't actually follow the riverside but ran higher up along what is now Westgate Road and the West Road. Our journey today starts just west of the Metro Bridge at Forth Banks, on the edge of the town centre. In the 1820s, George Stephenson and his son Robert opened the world's first purpose-built steam locomotive factory here. On South Street, just off Forth Street, they made the engines for the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the first public railway in the world to use steam engines. In 1829, the factory produced the famous rocket for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Stephenson's works had a global reputation and exported to countries around the world. However, it was its very success that spelt the end. By the end of the 19th century, the site had become too small for the needs of the business, and in 1901-2, the company moved its operations from the Newcastle works to a new and bigger factory in Darlington. In 1817, the brothers Robert and William Hawthorne established an engine works, also at Forth Banks. Originally millwrights, they later began building locomotives and marine engines. In 1872, the Hawthornes opened a marine engine works in the east end of Newcastle, and in 1886 merged their company with the Hebburn shipbuilder Andrew Leslie to become Hawthorne Leslie. The new firm controlled both the shipyard and the engine works at St Peter's, as well as the locomotive works at Forth Banks. When Stephenson's locomotive works relocated at the beginning of the 20th century, Hawthorne Leslie took over most of their Forth Banks site. From 1840 until his death in 1875, William Hawthorne lived in a house called Benwill Cottage, just to the west of Benwill Towers. The name is misleading, as it was actually a large house standing in extensive grounds. A short distance west of Forth Banks, just beyond the Redgeff Bridge, you come to the site of Elsick Lead Works. No trace remains today of this factory, which occupied a site here at Low Elsick for almost 250 years. The lead works was established in the 1770s on 2 acres of what had been riverside meadows. By 1800, it had grown very successful, making white lead, which was used for paint, red lead for glassworks and potteries, lead shot for military and sports purposes, and sheet lead used in the chemical and construction industries. The company owned lead works in other parts of the country, but the Elsick factory was the biggest. In the 1980s, Elsick Lead Works was absorbed into the Cookson Group, a multinational with a diverse portfolio of activities, led by the Cookson family, a dynasty of coal-owning and industrial entrepreneurs who lived in Benwill during the 19th century. The Elsick Lead Works itself closed in 2002. This was a truly horrible industry to work in, as many of its products were poisonous, and employees suffered serious health problems. One of the notable features of the lead works was the shot tower. This was 174 feet high and was used in the making of lead shot. Workers climbed up the inside of the tower to drop molten lead into a water-filled trough at the bottom. The tower was finally demolished in 1969. As late as the mid-19th century, there was very little industry apart from the lead works in this area immediately west of Forth Banks. But if we jump ahead 50 years, the map shows the lead works now surrounded by other industry. To the east, the Forth Banks goods yard, to the west, the gas works, and a large leather works. Newcastle has a very long history of manufacturing and exporting leather. The Richardson family was associated with the business of tanning for many generations. In 1785 they set up on Tyneside, first in North Shields, thus the origins of the road called Tanner's Bank, leading up from the quayside there. Later they developed production in Newcastle, moving to increasingly large sites in and around the town. In 1863 they set up what was then a state-of-the-art factory at Low Elsick, on a site between Armstrong's Elsick Works and the Elsick Gas Works, bounded by the river to the south and the Newcastle-Carlisle Railway to the north. The factory was large, covering about 3 acres. The Richardsons were Quakers and treated their workers better than most local employers. For example, they provided housing in streets near the factory. The Richardsons themselves lived locally, albeit in rather more spacious homes. These 2 large houses, the Gables and Ashfield House, were on Elsick Road at a safe distance away from the noise and stink of their factory. These photographs were taken at the end of the 19th century, but many of the techniques used at Richardson's changed little over the years. This was another industry that wasn't good for the health of its employees or the local environment. One Richardson's son who didn't join the company was the actor Sir Ralph Richardson, who, as it happens, didn't speak with a Geordie accent. By the 1960s, the leather-making industry was becoming increasingly unprofitable. The Elsick Leather Works were taken over by a competitor, the multinational Barrow Hepburn, intent on reducing capacity in the industry. As a result, the Elsick factory was closed in 1971, and there's now no evidence of its existence in the landscape. Moving further west, we come to the former site of Armstrong's works. This began in 1847, when William Armstrong and his partners bought 5.5 acres of land on the riverside at Elsick and set up an engineering factory. 10 years earlier, Armstrong had commissioned a survey of the whole stretch of the riverside between the town and Scotswood. This plan shows that while most of the land was empty mudflats, there were some small industries in this area, such as factories making copperas and bleach. These disappeared when Armstrong and his colleagues developed the land for their engineering works. So the area wasn't quite the rural idyll, as it's sometimes depicted, before Armstrong's factory opened. These chemical processes would have been toxic as well as unpleasant. There's also much evidence of coal mining in the area. The oldest pits in West Newcastle were in Elsick, and there were many different pits there over the centuries. There are few traces of them. The records are sketchy and incomplete. The 1837 survey plan shows the curiously named Crooked Billet, the old name used for the bat used in cricket or for the ancient game of tipcat, just above the staiths from which the coal was transported down the river. The name lived on for many years as the name of a local pub. There were once 54 pubs along the old Scotswood Road, by the way. The 1857 Ordnance Survey map shows both the Crooked Billet, then called just the Billet, and the Beaumont Pit slightly to the north of it. The Beaumont Pit was linked by a railway to Armstrong's engineering works, supplying it with coal. Coal mining ended here during the Second World War. The plan shows the coal stays at Elsick, from which coal was carried downriver to be exported. There used to be coal stays all the way along the Tyne, but all of them had gone by the 1980s, apart from the huge wooden structure of Dunstan stays, which were opened in 1893 by the North East Railway Company. These stays have been restored as a heritage site, and you can get a good view of the West Newcastle riverside from there. When it first set up on the Elsick riverside in 1847, Armstrong's built hydraulic machinery. Among its early products was a hydraulic crane to load and unload ships on Newcastle's quayside. The company soon began to build other things, such as bridges. The swing bridge was one of its products. This made it easier to transport Armstrong's goods downriver to the sea. But the business really took off when it moved into armaments. The factory made a variety of guns, tanks and other armaments. It was a common sight to see a tank being tested on the streets above the factory. Children playing in the streets had to jump out of the way as the tanks passed. In the 1880s, a shipyard was opened on the Elsick site. This gave Armstrongs the capacity to build and equip a warship from the raw materials to the finished product fully equipped with guns. Armstrongs became the most successful exporter of warships in the world, including battleships, submarines and torpedo cruisers. The Japanese Navy was one of the company's biggest customers. At one time, Armstrong's was one of Tyneside's largest employers, and certainly the biggest in the West End of Newcastle. At the beginning of every shift, men streamed down the steep terrace streets to work in the factory. Some of Armstrong's senior partners lived locally, such as the Crudders family, who occupied a large house with spacious grounds just north of the Scotswood Road. Thus the name Crudders Park, adopted later for the surrounding area. Armstrong himself lived in Jesmond Dean House. The present-day park used to be his garden, but later had a mansion built for himself near Rothbury. As well as being a family home, Cragside, with its extensive grounds, was ideal for entertaining prospective clients and for testing armaments. By the end of the 19th century, the Armstrong site covered 50 acres and stretched for 3/4 of a mile along the river front. In 1970, the works still occupied a huge site. The company was by then known as Vickers Armstrongs, following a merger, but only a few years later the works were closed and the site redeveloped to create a business park. The only visible evidence of the huge engineering works that once dominated this riverside site is a series of heritage interpretation boards and some pieces of public art. By the end of the 19th century, industrial development was also taking place on the south side of the Tyne, opposite Elsick. The Co-op flour mills, built on the riverfront at Dunstan between 1887 and 1891, was one of the country's first reinforced concrete buildings. In 1909, the CWS opened a soap factory on an adjacent site. Both were demolished at the end of the 20th century. Further west, there were other industries along the south bank, including ship repairers, ironworks, chemical works and engine works, although there was nothing comparable to the scale and significance of Armstrong's engineering works at Elsick. It was not only the land along the riverbanks that was transformed by the advent of the large engineering works in the mid-19th century. The river itself looked different. When Sopwith carried out his survey, there were 3 islands in the Tyne opposite Elsick. The biggest was the 34-acre King's Meadow. Its 2 smaller neighbours were called the Clarence Islands. King's Meadow used to be let as farmland, and the farmhouse also served as a pub. This photograph of Armstrong's works was taken from King's Meadow Island. In the 1880s, the island was dug up to allow the warships that were being built at the works to travel downstream. Beyond the former site of the Armstrong works, the footpath leaves the river and turns north to meet the Scotswood Road. Continuing west along the riverside, we come to the delightfully named Paradise. There used to be a small village here, with homes, a church, a pit, and other industrial activities such as a colour works, another of those unpleasant early chemical works. This photograph, dating from the 1880s, shows Paradise Village viewed from across the river. You can see the rows of houses near the river, and behind them stands a big house called Paradise House. Next to the village is the pit and William Cochrane Carr's brickworks. Brickmaking went hand in hand with coal mining, so it's not surprising there were several brickworks along the riverside. Bricks made on Tyneside were exported to countries across Europe and the United States. Benwell Colliery supplied fire clay from its mines to the brickworks at Paradise. No sign of this remains today, apart from one industrial enterprise that's largely hidden from sight on the waterfront. The company of Jobling Purser moved to Paradise from a riverside site at Walker during World War I. During the war, it did a swap with Vickers Armstrongs, who needed a suitable site to expand wartime production. Surprisingly, Jobling Purser is still a family firm today. The site it occupies was the westernmost part of Vickers Elsick site. The company was originally engaged in importing organic phosphate, otherwise known as bird dung, to be sold as fertiliser. When ICI and other companies developed more sophisticated fertilisers, it diversified into bitumen manufacturing and road building. Until well into the 20th century, Jobling Purser used barges to transport materials. The Jobling Purser site is also the place where the shaft of the Paradise Pit emerged above ground. Nearby were the Benwell coal staiths, shown on the 1837 plan. Above here was Benwell Colliery with its 3 pits, including the Charlotte Pit on what's now Condacombe Road, which was the last pit to close in Benwell. These pits were linked by a wagonway, which ran south to the coal staiths on the river. At this time, there was also a Benwell fishery in this area. And nearby the Benwell boathouse, from where the Benwell ferry crossed the river. This was just one of the many ferries that once crossed the Tyne in the past. There were also 2 between Elsick and Dunston, one at Redgeoff and one at Scotswood. As industry grew along both banks of the river, these ferries carried workers between the different factories. Immediately north of the boathouse was the South Benwell Electric Light Works. Although not strictly speaking on the riverside, it deserves to be remembered. The factory was established in 1880 by Joseph Swan in partnership with William Armstrong and others. It was the first factory in Europe to manufacture electric lamps. Swan was a pioneer of electric power. He invented the electric light bulb, developing his incandescent filament lamp in 1879. Around the same time, Thomas Edison in America developed a similar lamp, so you can argue about who was first. In 1880, Moseley Street in Newcastle became the first street to be lit by electric light using Swan's lamps. The South Benwell factory closed in 1887 and production was moved to the south of England. There's now no trace of the original factory. Just west of here lay the small pit village of Delaval. In 1899, Armstrong built a second factory on a riverside site between Delaval and the old Scotswood village. This was a purpose-built munitions works, designed to mass-produce shells and fuses. Its heyday was during the First World War, when it produced 13,000 guns, as well as shells, fuses and cartridge cases. Employment at the factory rose dramatically to meet the demands of war, and special housing had to be built to accommodate the munitions workers. A significant proportion of the workforce were women, known commonly as munitionettes. When the war was over, they lost their jobs to men returning home from the armed forces. Although it was best known as an armaments manufacturer, the Scotswood Works also made other engineering products such as locomotives and tractors. The Scotswood Works covered a large riverside site immediately east of the Scotswood Bridge. Computer-based technologies began to be introduced at the works in the 1970s, but many of the production processes continued to be based on specialised manual skills and traditional equipment. When the Elsick Works closed in the 1970s, the Scotswood Works were redeveloped. Tank production was transferred to the Scotswood site, but with only a fraction of the jobs. It wasn't long before Vickers, as it was now called, closed the factory altogether, ending its long dominance of the West Newcastle riverside. Scotswood had other industries too. The Northumberland paper mill was owned by the Grace family. The founder, Nathaniel Grace, lived at Scotswood House and his nephew William in Scotswood Villa. William's sons took over the business after his death, but moved it to Swalwell. As well as being important local employers, the Graces were also influential in public affairs, lobbying successfully, for example, for the building of the first Scotswood Bridge across the Tyne. When the paper mill closed at the beginning of the 20th century, the site was taken over by Adamses to manufacture sanitary ware. Its baths, sinks, and especially toilets became famous and at one time furnished a large proportion of the country's bathrooms. Later, it diversified into other products, such as garden ornaments. Adamses had also taken over a nearby fireclay works to provide the raw materials for their products. It's appropriate that the final site on our Lost Industries tour is a coal mine. Coal underpinned industrial development of this area, both because it offered a ready source of power to fuel industrial activity and because it was the profits from coal mining that provided most of the money to finance new enterprises. The Low Montague Pit stood just west of the Denton Burn, where the B&Q store is today. It was sunk in 1750 and was an important local employer. The pit is notorious as the place where 38 men and boys died on the 30th of March 1925 when the pit flooded. They were trapped when miners working at the coalface accidentally broke through to old workings in the disused Paradise Pit. This was an accident that could have been avoided. It led to changes in the laws governing mine safety. Too late for the victims at Scotswood. The pit closed altogether in 1934, the very last working pit in a part of Newcastle that once teemed with them. The coal Klondike was over.